Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we pot up some spring vegetable plants and also start some onion seeds. So let's go. Today is February 9th and I have a bunch of plants that look wonderful, but they need to be potted up. And I figured I'd show you my process for potting up these plants. And also I have some onions that I'm going to start from seed. The three plants that we're going to pot up today are Swiss chard, spinach, and Brussels sprouts. We planted some of these in a previous video, and you can see just in a short matter of time, they really have put on a lot of growth. In fact, each of these plants are about a month old. So that shows you that we definitely want to be starting plants at the right time. You don't want to start them too early, but you also don't want to start them too late. And on the back of your seed packet, it typically will tell you when to start your plants. And that's going to be based on the last frost date for the zip code that you live at. You can find the last frost date very easily just by doing a search on the internet. So keep that in mind, that when you're watching my videos or anyone else's videos, that we all are starting plants at different times, and it's all dependent on when our last frost date is. And even though in many of my videos I tell you that I'm zone 5B, just keep in mind you might be zone 5B also. But your last frost date might be different than my last frost date. The last frost date is dependent on your zip code. So I just wanted to clarify that in case you were confused and you weren't quite sure. When we talk about our zones, like for me it's zone 5B, that really has to do with what plants I can grow that will survive during my winter months. So something that's hardy down in a warmer area might not survive up here where I live, because our temperatures can get down as low as -15 degrees Fahrenheit. So a plant that cannot survive in those temperatures will not survive in my zone. So I just want to hope that clarifies any confusion that you might have when it comes to starting seeds and knowing when to start them. And when it comes to planting out all of these cooler weather crops, I can try to plant them out a little bit sooner in terms of a cold frame or a greenhouse or adding any additional protection. So you also want to keep that in mind, that when you have a crop, let's say lettuce or spinach or something like that, and it says that you can plant that out 2 to 3 weeks before your last frost. If you have a high tunnel or a greenhouse, or you have some protection over your raised beds, that means you can plant it out maybe even an additional 1 to 2 weeks before that, as long as you're providing that appropriate protection. And that's what I'm planning to do with many of these crops, which is why I started them earlier than I probably should have, according to the back of the seed packages. So in regards to Swiss chard, it says, according to my research, to plant it outside 2 to 3 weeks before my last frost. Well, my last frost date is May 15th. And so if I count backwards, let's say 3 weeks from May 15th, that would bring me to April 24th. And so that means safely I should be able to plant my Swiss chard around that date. However, if I give additional protection to my plants, that means I can plant it out even 1 or 2 weeks before April 24th. And that's basically the type of thing you're looking for also when it comes to your plants, is you want to make sure you know your last frost date, and then you count backwards from that date based on the plant that you're growing. And for spinach, it says for spinach to plant it out 2 to 4 weeks before my last frost. So I'm looking at about middle of April, but with additional protection, it could even be as early as early April. And then for Brussels sprouts, now that's a funny one, and that's one that I've never grown before. And I've heard that it can be a little tricky to grow, especially in the areas where your summers are very hot. Well, here where I live, where it tends to be more on the cooler side, what I'm aiming for is I'm hoping to have a spring crop and then also possibly a fall crop. And a lot of times when you read about Brussels sprouts, they really focus on, how to get a fall crop. So I'm going to try to get that spring crop if possible, and give the Brussels sprout seedlings what they need. And this will be a good test for us just to see if that can work. And so it says here that I can plant out my Brussels sprouts as soon as my soil can be worked. Typically that's sometime in April. So my goal is to get all of these plants to a really nice, good big size so that I can then get them planted out in my gardens. So what I wanted to share was that when I've been bottom watering these plants, which is just basically taking out like a 6-pack, pouring about 1 or 2 inches of water in the bottom of this tray, putting the 6-pack back in, and letting the plants soak up the water, which usually takes about 15 minutes or so. And then I pour out the rest of the water into a bucket because you don't want your plants sitting in water. And what I've noticed while I've been doing that is 2 things. The first thing being that I've been having to water these plants quite frequently because the plants are actually getting to a good size and they're basically telling me that they need to be bumped up into a bigger size container or pot. And also, I want to show you that when you look at the bottom of the cell packs, they're actually, the plant's roots are starting to be exposed. And that's another indicator that the plant is outgrowing its small little cell pack and it needs to be bumped up. And so what I'm planning to do is pot these up into 3-inch pots that are square. And I like 3-inch square pots because with my 10 by 20 tray, I can put 3 pots going this way. And if I, way back when I used to garden, I used to use circular pots and that works too. But in terms of maximizing the amount of space in my tray, I like the square pots and I can fit 3-inch pots going this way. So what we're gonna do now is pot up a couple of these plants together. I got these 3-inch pots on Amazon a few years ago and I like to reuse my pots. They've been very sturdy for me. And when you're reusing pots, you just want to make sure you sterilize your pots. And I do have videos showing how to sterilize pots, and I'll make a link to that in the description below. I like to make my own potting mix because I do a lot of gardening in terms of filling up pots and containers, both indoors and outdoors. So in the long run, it saves me a lot of money. But by all means, you can buy your own potting mix. And I'll put a link below, though, just so you know my process for making my own potting mix. So what we're looking at here is these are the Brussels sprouts. And again, the roots are just coming out from the bottom. And so it's really time to bump these up into a bigger container. And you can see that the roots look good and healthy. Typically with plants in general, you don't want them to be so pot bound or root bound where all the roots are wrapping around. You want to make sure you're potting them up well before it gets to that point. So this actually is a good size plant that can be potted up at this time. And in terms of how deep to plant it, you just want to make sure that the roots are below the soil surface and that the green part of the plant is above the soil surface. Even though it's only February, I'm okay potting plants up like this because it's just a matter of another few weeks. And then I can even start bringing these plants out on what I call my rolling cart. It's just this big cart that my husband made with scrap materials around the house. And I like to put plants on there and bring them out on the nice warm days and then bring them back in at night, especially because we still have freezing temperatures at night. And so before you know it, these plants will no longer be indoors under my grow lights. They'll be out on that rolling cart. And that plant is good. So let's go ahead and do a spinach plant next. And the soil has already been pre-moistened because when I made my own potting mix, I put boiling hot water in there just to sterilize it and to kill off any possible fungus gnat eggs. And so I don't need to add any additional water. But if you were using some sort of a potting mix, you just want to make sure that it's not dry. What you're looking for with your potting mix is when you squeeze it, you don't want any additional water to come out, but you want it to be wet enough so that the soil holds its form. This year, I'm planning on doing a lot of vegetables in pots. Most vegetables need full sun. And where I live, I have certain pockets of areas in my yard that get full sun, but not a ton. So I need to be strategic on where I'm going to plant my vegetable plants this year. So if you don't have a very big yard, or you have a yard that has mostly shade but pockets of sun, then I think that my future videos will be helpful to see how I'm growing my vegetables in containers and pots. Now, when it comes to the Swiss chard and the spinach, I'm not sure how they would grow indoors, just if I wanted to keep a few plants for indoor growing. So I might experiment with that. I'll have to see. I know that certain plants, like herbs, for example, like basil, cilantro, those do really well even indoors under your grow lights. And since I've already invested in grow lights, it's nice to be able to grow some food indoors as well. So I'll have to see if spinach is one of those plants that, or even Swiss chard, that you can, start harvesting indoors. I'm kind of thinking you can. Speaking of lettuce, the lettuce that we planted together in a previous video is looking great. So I'll be making an update video on any plants that I started from seed. I'll probably do that within the near future. So you'll be on the lookout for that. So I have a ton of plants. I don't know how many, but quite a few. But what I wanted to do just for this video was I just wanted to show you the basics of what I'm potting up and how I'm doing it. And again, my goal is I will have, the plants in trays like this, and I'll clean out this soil that's here. But this whole tray will get filled, and then I can keep bottom watering this tray. And when I bottom water at this point, I am bottom watering with a little bit of fertilizer mixed in with my water. And I'm only watering these pots once they feel really light. And also when the top of the soil starts to look like a light brown color, that's a good indicator that tells me it's a good time to water. You don't want to water your plants too much. That can kill your plants, but you also don't want to underwater them. That can kill your plants. So over time, you'll get used to, the needs for the different plants, but those are just little tips to look for. So now that we've done these three, I'm going to go ahead and finish potting up all my spring vegetable crops, and I'll show you what they look like when I'm done. Well, I was making good progress, and you can see that the plants are doing well with the transplant. However, I ran into a problem, which was I ran out of potting mix. So I figured it's a good opportunity for us to go ahead and mix up some potting mix together. And that way you can see me doing that, as well as pouring the boiling hot water into my mix. So let's go and do that. So we're in my garage, and this is where I keep my seed starting supplies and potting mix supplies. So this is a big bale of peat moss, but you could use cocoa coir, and you want to use some sort of a container. And I just like to use this bowl, but whatever container you use, that's going to be how you measure your parts. So each bowlful is equivalent to 1 part. And I'm in my garage, and so a lot of times you don't want to be inhaling all of this, but there's a lot of good airflow and circulation. I do have my garage door open, so I feel comfortable doing this without a mask on. And you can see that there's some pieces out there that I can pull off that are part of the peat moss, and that's fine. So that would be 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, 5 parts, 6 parts, and 7 parts. And you can see that the 7 parts fills up the container to about, I'd say it's 25% full. And what we'll do next is I'm actually going to add just a little bit lime into this. And that helps offset the pH of the peat moss. And you can see it's just powdery. It's not a pelletized lime. I believe the name is dolomite lime, but it's a powder form of lime. And honestly, I'm just sprinkling it on top. This is how I've done it for years. And there were years I didn't add any lime, and it was fine. But it's my understanding that it's better to add the lime to help offset the pH levels of the peat moss. So I just added a tiny bit of the lime. And at this point, I can add a couple of things. I could add perlite, and perlite helps with draining. And that's good for just overall water drainage. And then if I wanted to add a little bit of vermiculite, I could add vermiculite as well. Vermiculite can be expensive, but it's also good for helping retain water. And every year I like to play around with the mix, because honestly, there's no right or wrong mixture out there. You can buy it, you can make it, and when you make it, each year it might change, your formula might change. I know mine has changed over the years. So I'm going to go ahead, and I just added 7 parts of the peat moss in here. So now I'm going to add 1 part of the vermiculite, and we'll mix it up and let's see what it looks like. I apologize. I'm in my garage. My car is in here. So I just figured we'd quickly do this. The main thing is so you can see me mixing it up. So here's 1 part, and I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And you can see it's definitely dusty. So again, you just want to be careful. You don't want to inhale that. So you can see it's starting to look more like the potting mix that you buy. And again, the key thing here is that you're using something that's either coco coir or peat moss. And that's to help, that's basically the main base of your potting mix. And then we're adding the perlite, and that just helps with water drainage. And in the past few years, you know, I've changed that formula around, but this is a formula that's been working for me recently, and I like it. I added a little bit of the lime, and I'm just going to add a tiny bit of the vermiculite as well, just to get that in there, and that would help with retaining water. And you can see I have a nice big bin right over here of the vermiculite. And I've done it both ways. I've done it where I didn't add any vermiculite and I've been fine. And I've done it where I've added some vermiculite and that's worked out fine as well. So basically I'm trying to show you, without confusing you, that you can make your own mixture and it's going to cost a lot less than buying it, especially if you're planting a ton of plants. But experiment, that's the key, and find something that works for you. Maybe you want to add worm castings or something else to your mixture. And actually, just by putting this in here, I'm seeing that I don't think I want a whole bowl full of it. I think I'm just going to do that much. And that's really not a lot when you look at it. We just sprinkled a small amount because there's really no science in this. It's just a matter of coming up with a mixture that works for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and make 1 more 7 parts of peat moss to 1 part of the perlite, and then just a small amount of the lime and a small amount of the vermiculite. All right, so we are all done. Let's head inside and we're going to mix in some boiling hot water. So I'm just using a large spoon, and I like to break up any big chunks of the peat moss that are in here. And before I add the boiling hot water, I just like to make sure I mix this as much as I possibly can. I like to use a seed starting mix when I'm starting seeds that are really, really, really small. Like I recently started seeds of wax begonias. And if you've been following my videos, then you know that the seeds of the wax begonia are like dust. And if I used anything like a potting mix, there's a chance that there'd be some big chunks in there that might get in the way of those little tiny seeds germinating. Now, with any sort of mix that you buy, if it's any sort of a potting mix, let's say, you absolutely can sift out the large pieces and use that potting mix as a seed starting mix. There's no rule that you have to use a quote unquote seed starting mix. But when it comes to starting those really tiny seeds, like again of my wax begonias, possibly even like snapdragons, anything that has a very, very small seed, I like to use the peat moss. And, you know, there are chunks in the peat moss, not much, but there are some. I take the chunks out with my hands. I don't need a strainer. But then I don't like to use the perlite, these big white balls of the perlite, because I feel like that gets in the way of those tiny seeds germinating. The vermiculite works for me in my seed starting mix. It helps retain the moisture that little seeds need, and it also does not get in the way in terms of its size. Perlite is used, again, to drain the water. It helps drain it. So that works out really well when you have a bigger plant growing. And it's also, it doesn't, you know, it's fine if you're starting a larger size seed. All right, I'd say that's good and mixed. So now what I'm going to do is I have a kettle of water and it's been boiling. So we're going to go ahead and pour that on. There are a lot of different ways that you can try to avoid getting fungus gnats. And one of them is by sterilizing your potting mix or your seed starting mix. And there are different ways to sterilize. You can cook it in the oven, you can cook it in your microwave, but from what I understand, that can smell quite a bit. So keep that in mind. And I've never done it, so I really don't know much about the process. For me, I just like to use the boiling hot water. And the key is with putting the boiling hot water is you want to make sure you're really mixing everything around in here, because it's hard to get to the bottom of this container. So I'm just making sure I'm getting to the bottom, because I want to make sure I get that hot water to basically touch all the peat moss that's in here. And there's really, it's hard to fully avoid fungus gnats, but you can try. And so that's what I'm doing, is I'm just trying. And usually fungus gnats are not harmful to larger plants. They're mostly harmful to the teeny tiny seedlings. The larvae of the fungus gnats, they basically chew the roots of your little tiny seedling plants. The adults that are flying around are just a nuisance. And especially if you get an infestation, it can kind of get out of control. And the way I look at it is I need to pre-moisten this anyway. I need to add water. So why not add boiling hot water? The only difference is by adding this boiling hot water, I then need to wait until this soil has cooled down. I don't want to be putting my hands in there while this is very hot. You can see I'm working around trying to get every corner. Go ahead, we're going to add some more water. And I see, again, a chunk from the peat moss. I'll pull that out later. Alrighty, so the boiling water has been added. The potting mix has been mixed up fully. So at this point, what I like to do is just basically seal it off. I want to close up any air gaps that are in here. And that way it keeps in the heat in the potting mix. So I'm just pushing down on all areas just to make sure we're sealing in all the heat. And then the next thing that we're going to do is cover it. And in this case, I'm just using this type of tote, but you can use whatever you have, but it's good to then cover it and keep in all that heat. And really, it just makes it an environment that something like a fungus gnat or the fungus gnat eggs cannot survive. So now that we play the waiting game, and I just need to wait until this cools down before I can use it. Well, I'm glad I was able to show you in this video just my process for making potting mix. And keep it simple, do what works for you. That the formula that I showed you works for me, but like I said, I can change it around a little bit here and there. And my experience has been that my seedlings and my plants do very well. But if I was to tweak the numbers a little bit, I'm pretty sure that they'd still do okay. Many times my experience has been the biggest thing that kills our little plants or our little seedlings is too much water. So just keep that in mind. There's so many other factors involved. Too much water is one of the big reasons why our seedlings die. And another big reason is when it comes time to harden them off, basically getting them used to the environment outdoors. So I will pot up the rest of the spinach, Brussels sprouts, and the Swiss chard later on after this video is done. But at least we were able to do some together. And when I show you a seedling update and do a tour of all my plants that I'm growing under my grow lights, I'll definitely be sure to show you what those plants look like now that they've been potted up into 3-inch pots. So to end this video, I figured we would grow some onions together. This will only be my second year growing onions. If I had a ton of sun in my yard, absolutely I would try every single vegetable there is out there that my family would eat. But because I have limited sun, I pick and choose the plants that I grow in my yard. But this year in particular, I'm really pushing myself to grow more vegetables because our family loves vegetables, and a lot of it will be done in pots. When it comes to the onions, I have to think about that and where I'm going to put them. I was thinking of just buying sets and going that route, but you can't go wrong for the price. I mean, it's $2.79 for a packet of seeds. And I figured I'm just going to buy them. And it was actually 40% off. It's either 30 or 40% off at Ocean State Job Lot, which, by the way, if you want to buy seeds and you're okay with like Burpee brand, Ocean State Job Lot is a great place to buy your seeds. Right when their seeds come out, they're pretty much marked down a fair percentage. Like I said, it's either 30 or 40%. So I was able to buy these, and I was very happy at a discounted price. Big thing with onion seeds is, of many of the vegetable seeds out there, onion seeds really don't last much more than a year, possibly 2 years. So for me, I'm just going to plant them all today, and I'm going to plant them in this restaurant to go container. It's okay to plant onion seeds like that. In fact, I recommend it. You don't want to plant one seed per cell in a 6 cell pack. Onion seeds really, while they're inside, they're pretty much just putting their energy into growing that bulb, the bottom part. The green part on the top, you can keep snipping that back as the plant's growing indoors and just garnish a salad or something with the top part of the plant. It's the bottom part that's, being fed and getting bigger. So in this to-go container, I already have some pre-moistened seed starting mix. I had some other plants that were growing in here before. They've been pricked out, so we're just going to reuse it. And we're going to go ahead and sprinkle all these seeds into this container. And I brought my laptop out because I want to share some information when it comes to onions. There are a couple of different kinds of onions out there, and there are the long day, the intermediate day, and then the short day varieties. And you would think, because of where I live here in, the Northeast in New Hampshire, that the stores would only sell the appropriate variety of onion seeds for this area. Well, that's not true. And I'll tell you about that in a little bit. I'm just going to grow what I was able to buy, and we'll see how they do. And actually, there's a ton of seeds here. I mean, I've already sprinkled quite a bit in here. So I am only going to do probably half the packet right now, and then I'll do another half of the rest of the packet in a different container. So the variety that we're planting together is called the gnat hybrid, and it says 120 days to harvest. The depth should be 1/4 inch. So I have seed starting mix here, and I will just lightly cover this. It's an exceptionally sweet, mild onion, and the seedlings will emerge after about 7 to 14 days. So I will be growing these indoors in this container. And once I plant them outside, that's the time that I'll be separating the plants. I will not be separating them while they're indoors, which is very different from most of the other plants that we grow indoors. Onions are the exception to that rule. They are fine if you mass sow them in a container like this. So let's go ahead and add some seed starting mix. And this has already been pre-moistened. It's seed starting mix that I made myself and sterilized it with the boiling hot water. And I'm just adding the lightest layer because it's set 1/4 inch. You can also use a potting mix. It doesn't have to be a seed starting mix. This container has holes in the bottom of it that I drilled. So when it comes to watering this, I can just take this container and put it in basically another container that doesn't have any holes in it, fill water in that, and bottom water it that way. So even though this has already been pre-moistened, we're just going to spray this with a small amount of water. And I'm just using clear saran wrap or plastic wrap. I've used it already for other plants, and I like to reuse it a number of times until I can't write on it anymore. And I'm just making sure I'm sealing this up. And we want to always make sure we label. So I'm just going to put on here onion. It's the gnat hybrid. And today's date, which is February 9th. I will be putting this on a heat mat because onions do like heat. Although I've had them germinate without the heat, but since I have heat mats this year, it's my first year having heat mats, I might as well put this on a heat mat. And I did read that germinating the onions is preferred if they have some bottom heat. So only long day and intermediate day types of onions are recommended for summer harvest in New England, which is where I live, since these types require at least 13 hours of daylight. Short day onions begin forming bulbs when days are 10 to 12 hours long and are typically grown in southern regions of the US, where they are planted in the winter. So that information is very helpful when you're buying your onion seeds or your onion sets. And this was the only type of onion seed that I could buy. And when I looked at it, and I brought it home and then looked at it, it said it's a short day variety. So the reason I want to share all that is not only knowing that, there's these different types of onions and that the northern climates, you should grow a certain type of onion versus the southern climates. But also that goes to show you that when it comes to things like onions, for me, I think in the future, I would prefer to buy my onion seeds online through an online seed company, because then I can pick the exact type of onion that I want. And I would make sure that I'm getting the long day or intermediate type onion seed, because that's what is better for my climate. However, this is what I have. This is what I'm going to grow. But nevertheless, I'm excited to give onions a second try. And I can't wait to show you the process of, following along with as these onions grow bigger and what I do with them out in my yard. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.